Hello, hello, and welcome. It is so wonderful to have you all here today. We are here with the Fairy Tales and Folklore panel. I'll give you a description of what we'll be talking about here. The delight and wonder of fairy tales and the rich oral traditions of folklore can provide wonderful inspiration for authors. How do we respect the traditions and cultures and the tales and that the tales and lore come from, and how can we make fairy tales and folklore for the worlds of our own stories? Join us as we discuss. So I'm going to pop into here just this event, maybe I can type commands so you guys can have that there. We also have other events going on now if you need to check out what else is going on. And then if you wish to ask a question during our panel today, please use the channel points down below. There should be a little fox icon, and that you should be able to ask a question there. So, hi, I am Amy Winters Voss, also known as ShyRedFox. I'm the author of Rise the Liminal Chronicles, in which I pulled heavily on Japanese folklore and mythology. And I'm here with the wonderful Jasmin, WriterGreg, and Fen, and I will have them each introduce themselves. So go ahead, Jasmin.
Hi, I'm Jasmin. Usually when you see me, it's as Coffee Quill's mod. She likes to call me her hammer mod because I have a tendency to ban and then unban and then reban people by accident. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Greg, you want to go next?
Hello, I'm WriterGreg, or Gregory. I can be found at twitch.tv/WriterGreg or WriterGreg.com. I am the writer of clean YA fairy tales adapted for a combined universe that I have. A couple of my stories have been published, and you can find those at WriterGreg.com.
Awesome. Okay, Fen, you're up next.
Hi, so I'm Fen Winters, also known as Fenrikin, VikingFenharel on Twitch, and Winters Tales on Facebook and Twitter. I authored the semi-viral piece that makes the rounds every so often called Old Gods and Aliens. That one's more mythology-based, but it still fits the bill, I feel. I tend to specialise in sort of like folklore of the British Isles, if you like.
Okay, well, we'll start out maybe talking about what's the difference between fairy tales and folklore.
That's going to depend on whether you're doing it as a story or academically, because folklore in the academic sense is basically anything a group of people tell each other to identify themselves within the culture versus outside of the culture. And this can be dances or the way that they teach craft. It can be stories. And then there's fairy tales where those tend to be a little bit more in the European range, and other things are squished into the box. There it is a little bit more of the supernatural side of things where fairies may show up and cause havoc.
Yeah, so fairy tales have usually got the standard story aspect of them, the beginning, a middle, and end, whereas folklore can be anything from a cautionary tale told as a fairy tale to hanging the horseshoe above your door to ward off evil spirits and trap the good luck. So it's fairy tales are part of folklore, but folklore is not necessarily part of fairy tales, if that makes sense. So one is an umbrella and one is part of it.
Agreed.
Alrighty. So, Jasmin, you had asked, talking about the point of where folk tales are a concept based on a form of colonization. Did you want to talk about that really quick?
So this is a really, people write entire theses about this, and I'm going to super generalize as fast as I can because it is its own thing. But the start of folklore starts with people in Western countries deciding that their ancient past is dying. So they're going to go out into these peasants and decide what the true stories are. And then a lot of the times they wrote down what they thought the true story was versus what they were told. So they kind of cherry pick what they liked from even their own people. When we start moving beyond Europe, folklore and fairy tales start getting used as a way to subjugate people. An example of this is Richard Templar. He was an individual with the British Army during the height of British colonization of the Punjabi region, that's now Pakistan and India, where he quite literally would cajole and possibly tortured bards to tell them the stories of the era. And then he decided what was right and wrong and then wrote it down as the stories of the Punjab. If you're in any of the Western cultures, you won't often see the actual stories of the Punjabi people. You will see his translations of it that have gone through about 4 different translations even before he got it, because he didn't speak Punjabi, he didn't speak the rural dialects. So he got what they called munchis to translate it into Persian and then into English, where he then changed it. These stories have quite often been used to force in Christianity ideas, to be like, look, this is almost similar to our story, so we're just going to change it a little bit and then show you what this is. A lot of stories that we have now aren't truthful to the people that told them. But also, if you start looking at something like folklore, it is not just the story, it's the words that are used, it's how it's told and where it's told. That's important, that you just don't get in a book. This isn't to say those books aren't amazing, but when we're looking at those books, especially in nowadays where we're looking at colonization, it is important to remember that a lot of those things came from this concept of they're less than us and we need to change that.
Those are some really good points there. Thank you for sharing. So I'm going to have us kind of go around, and I'll start with Fen, since Fen got to go last time. Let's share some of our favorite fairy tales and folklore. So go ahead, Fen.
So I come from a half Irish family, so a lot of my knowledge in folklore is based in that, which Irish folklore itself has got its own problems with colonization from English. But I think one of my favourites is the story of the 7 sons who get turned into swans. There are 7 sons and 1 sister. Evil stepmother type deal. Evil stepmother turns all the sons into swans to get rid of them. And the sister is told that the only way she can break this curse is by sewing them 7 shirts made out of nettles, and she must never utter a word whilst she gathers the nettles or sews. So she sews for 7 years, never uttering a word, and she only manages to finish 7 shirts, but the last shirt is missing an arm. So when she finally saves her brothers, one of her brothers keeps his wing, and he just goes, I don't care, I'm keeping it. That one in itself has actually been changed by Christianity and the colonization of the English, because one of the better known versions of that is that St. Patrick comes along and just goes, by the blessing of the Lord, your curse is removed. I'm not going to say that my version is the original, but it's the one that I knew, so I was surprised that there was another version when I was younger. I was very cross about it, I remember.
Okay, Greg, you're up next.
I come to my love of fairy tales and folklore a little different way. Is I'm a father of many children, and while I loved the fairy tales growing up, I loved them even more telling them to my children. And I didn't always want to read the Disneyfication of the fairy tales. I wanted to get into the real stuff, the original, the Grimm, the ones that have been collected in public domain. And when I was reading them, I would say, wow, that's weird, or wow, that makes no sense whatsoever. I hate instant love. I hate a lot of the tropes that happen with fairy tales. And I said, well, if I don't like it, maybe I can try something different. I can write my own versions of the fairy tales. So I love taking a fairy tale, maybe one that's not as well known, stripping it down to its fundamental plot points, character tropes, and then squeezing it into a world that makes more sense from the point of view of modern storytelling, modern tropes, modern ways that we tell stories. So a 300-word Grimm fairy tale then turns into like a 6,000 word short story with proper character arcs, proper conflict, justifications, and stuff like that. And so I I love the fairy tales that I've adapted, and it's just fun to then read them to my kids who are unfortunately slowly getting out of the phase of having dad read them a bedtime story.
But it's sweet that you did that. Very cool. All right, Jasmin, go ahead.
So my love of folklore and fairy tales comes from two different sides. On one side, my family is a group of people who've been unlanded repeatedly by people. We're Jewish on one side, and then a whole bunch of people of different colored backgrounds, as much as I'm pasty. My grandfather was part Indian, part Black. And sometimes what I got of those cultures that we were no longer connected with are these like very thin strands of the original folklores, because that's what they were comfortable talking about. But then my dad taught me how to read using folklore and fairy tales, and that I'm very dyslexic, so reading for me is really hard. And then when I got into college, I learned that there is a degree for folklorist in mythology. Really annoyed I didn't know about that earlier, because I would have done that as a master's if I did. Where I started getting to learn lots of stories from different places around the world and seeing humanity represented in so many different ways. One of my favorite stories came up when I was learning from one of my teachers who just got back from trying to collect the few Persian stories remaining in the places that we now call Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. Because of Islam, some of the traditional ones have been kind of falling away, which is fine. But this one is a Persian one, and it's based around a cake where you can actually make the cake, which I also like baking, so that was fun, where this woman sees a prince and goes, I'm going to marry him, and bakes him this cake twice, and he goes, you know what, I'm going to marry you. And I love the idea that this cake was so good that this guy was like, yeah, I'm totally going to marry this girl.
That is awesome. That is just awesome. Oh, we're getting rated by World Anvil too. Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it. So, some of my favorites. I have a lot of favorites, but I'll keep it to two. Some of my favorite folklores are about the foxes, because I fell in love with foxes when I was in college. We had a family of them living behind us when I was in college, and so when I started researching for my story for my book, I got to look up the kitsune shapeshifters, the foxes in Japanese mythology, and I fell in love with them. I loved the story of Kudzu no Ha, the kudzu leaf. That's her name, and she was the mother of one of the most famous sorcerers in Japan, and it's just a delightful story. But most Japanese tales end with, and the mythological creature left, and I'm like, no. Oh, it's so heartbreaking. The other one that I absolutely love is, I think it's Finnish, it's at least northern Scandinavia, the East of the Sun, West of the Moon tale, where a bear, someone who appears to be a bear, comes to ask for a girl's hand in marriage, and they end up getting married. They're very happy. I mean, he's human for part of it, but she can never look on his face, and when she does, he gets whisked away and she has to rescue him. And so I love that one, because it's not the girl rescuing her. It's not the guy rescuing the girl. It's the other way around. So that's one of the things I love about it. So those are some of my favorites. So I obviously talked about a little bit about me being a Japan fanatic, and that I like to research tales about Japan so that I can use aspects, but do it respectfully as best I can. So what, if you didn't talk about it already, what are the areas and the regions that you guys are most interested in?
I guess I can take that one first. I love the stories from all of the different places. I really like the Polynesian. I'm getting into more Japanese and Chinese, the fairy tales from those cultures, to try to round out my understanding of fairy tales better. But I do love the European ones, because those are the ones I grew up in, specifically mythology. I've enjoyed mythology, especially the Norse and Greek mythology, a whole lot more than the fairy tales. And I love, you know, those kind of fairy tales with the heroes, the epic journeys, and things like that. And it really has informed me in my storytelling. And yeah, those are the things that I like to read and I like to write about.
So I already mentioned, but I'm mostly interested in the Irish side of things, and I sort of vaguely said the British Isles, but Irish mythology and folklore is where my heart really is, because it's testament to, it's interesting on so many levels, because these stories have been around for so long, but Ireland has suffered so much under the English, and there is so much that has been changed as part of the culture, and the stories that have seeped through the cracks to still be told so many years later, despite the best efforts of the English, they're the ones that I really fall in love with. I love fairy tales and folklore, especially in Europe, as a form of rebellion. The same was in Scotland, the same was in Wales, same in Cornwall. Not many people realise that Cornwall is kind of a micronation on its own. The fairy tales and the folklore were these cultures' ways of staying alive despite the best efforts of the English, and I will forever love that so much.
I tend to skip around a lot. I do a lot in India and the Middle East. Those are massive areas with lots of different backgrounds. But I also like going down into Africa. Now, part of that is there isn't a lot in the west of those cultures to begin with that have been transported over here respectfully. So you kind of reach a dead end very quickly and then just need to move on to the next thing because it just hasn't migrated here in a way that I can research it in a respectful way. And I don't have the backgrounds that my teachers did where I can just go places and be like, please tell me your stories.
One other thing I forgot to kind of talk about, we kind of defined folklore and fairy tales, but at least where I've been learning more about, because I didn't know a lot about Japanese mythology before I started my book. For at least in Japan, the fairy tales and folklore are like interweaved with the mythology. It's like you can't separate them, and so I don't know if you guys have any points on that for other cultures, but that's what I've been seeing because it's such a mesh of beliefs over there.
I do if nobody else has something to say first.
You are very excited. The mic is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, folklore is the lore of folk as the most basic thing. So most people didn't wake up one day and go, this is folklore and this is mythology and this is what we do for fun. If you go to the vast majority of cultures, and especially ones that are not westernized the way Europe is, like even if you get into more of the background areas of European countries, the way they function is completely different. Like they will decide that they are harvesting their fields only during a certain point, whether or not that even makes sense to the rest of us. They're like, no, you only do it during the full moon. And that's just because that's the way they've done it for ages. And they may even know that it's ridiculous, but that's what you do. And so, yeah, sometimes when I'm looking at people trying to separate out folklore and fairy tales and mythology, it's a little bit difficult because nobody who lives those stories on any form does that. It works great if you're in a monotheistic culture like Christianity, even Judaism and Islam to a certain extent. But as soon as you get into sort of the messier religions that are like shamanism or animism, animism is everything has a spirit, which is what Shintoism is in Japan. You can't separate it because that doesn't make sense. It makes sense only by the people who drew these boxes that now everybody's trying to fit things into, because, you know, people got to draw boxes for some reason.
Well said.
And
So,
I think it is one interesting point is one person's religion is another person's mythology, because as a Christian, I believe in the Bible and those standard tenets, but I believe that Norse is a mythology. I believe the Greeks are a mythology. But if I went back 1,000 years into the past, then they would believe that that is the actual religion. And so I think the important thing is, when we need to pay respect, is to realize people believe this today, in the past, and we need to treat it with that respect. And it goes for all of the different elements that we put into our stories, is that we have respect for the original people and the current practitioners of those religions, and say, we may call it a mythology, but they call it a religion. And I think if we come to storytelling from that point of view, realizing that someone somewhere holds this sacred, I think we'll be coming from a much better place.
I know that in the study of mythology and folklore, they're definitely trying to be like, stop putting Christianity and other monotheistic religions as like a real belief above all of these other ones, because that immediately brings a bias into how you're looking at something. Because for a very long time, nobody seemed to really practice certain religions, but sometimes that's because we ignored the practitioners. Sometimes nowadays people are coming back to those religions either because they feel connected with it or some way, or that was the original religion of where they're from. And it is a very sticky point to try and put lines around the religion, the mythology, the folklore, the fairy tales, because so often they bleed into one another in that culture totally naturally. Like, nobody would look at Jesus's stories that he tells his apostles and go, those are folklore if you're Christian. But from an outside perspective, that's what they are.
Yeah, one of my favorite lines from Spider-Man Far From Home is when Tom Holland is talking to Mysterio, and he says, well, we used to have in my religion class, and now we study him in physics. And the interesting thing, that not only in the modern MCU, but what the whole Marvel did with the Norse characters, is they extracted it out of a religion, and I turn it into modern day folklore, because they took the characters and turned them into superheroes. And whether that's respectful or not, I'm not going to get into that characteristic, but we do need to realize that, the Thor we see on the movie screen, the Thor we see in the pages, and Loki and Frigga and Odin and all that, those are not the deities that people worshipped, but a variation, a fan fiction, if you will, an adaptation of the true characters. And if I personally wish they just called it something different. Sure, you can be inspired by it, but where you're taking the actual name and the actual characters, it's just kind of like,
In an example that I'm using, I will be pulling from a character named Sojobo, who's the head of the Tengu. And I'm going to try to stick to what I can find about him, including some of the parts of his nature that would make me go, like he falls in love with his students. I'm like, today's culture would not go for that. But I'm going to try to stick to it as closely as I can, and then anything that I create around him can be all the craziness. So I try to make him as accurate as I can, and then make him, anything I add to him, I try to make cool so that it's never putting him down. So, Fen, did you have anything?
I think Jazz and Greg have both covered all the points marvelously, and you have as well. Thank you.
Okay. So the next question I had on here, I think we'll save retellings for near the end. So what do you guys have for advice for making a retelling unique, or using aspects in your stories?
That one's a tricky one, because let's go with one of the most famous retellings, King Arthur. King Arthur is a retelling that is old. and it is basically a retelling on top of a retelling on top of a retelling on top of a retelling. We think he might have been real at one point. There was a skeleton that was unearthed that was dated back to the 1100s, and he's buried in Glastonbury. I visited the gravesite very recently. It was quite cool, but we don't, you know, some of his knights were werewolves. One of his knights was invincible with the power of virginity. So a lot of it is folklore that all got ascribed to one guy. So making your own folklore or making a popular piece of folklore or a fairy tale unique, retelling it in a unique way, is going to be hard because there's this pressure nowadays to not make it too fantastical almost, even though fairy tales are supposed to be fantastical. So the best thing you can do is just take the essential parts of that, like going back to the Thor and the Loki analogy. Thor is the god of thunder, Loki is the god of mischief, and they focused on that, and that is fine. And Loki even alludes to the point that they're not actually gods in that universe. He says the mortals perceive us as gods. So, you know, personally, when I'm taking a story that I love and I'm making it a retelling, I keep the important bits, and I've got to really sort of like analyze the story that I'm retelling and figure out what about the story is important and needs to be kept, and then everything else is just set dressing.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, because when you think of there has been a saying that every single story has been already told. But I would add to that, and others add to this, but they haven't been told by you. Each of us as authors are unique individuals with our own backgrounds, individualism. We bring our own unique spin to every story we tell. You could give the four of us the exact same prompt, and we would come up with vastly different stories, and they would each be, I think, fun interpretations and a way to peer into each of our souls through the words that we write down. And what is, we do need to boil things down to its essence, and that's what I like to do with the fairy tales that I adapt. Is we have character A is character B, and they do C for the conflict. Well, that could be 1,000 different stories. Well, yeah, a lot of the fairy tales follow the exact same patterns across different cultures, and it works just fine. I mean, the most blatant example is how the Roman pantheon is just a very light redoing of the Greek pantheon. But but even the Loki, the god of mischief, has a counterpart in Native American culture as the crow, as in Africa as the Anansi, or the spider. And so even with very, very wide variety of cultures, they still have the same element of a trickster god. And we, in our different stories, we can say, hey, I want to tell a story about a trickster god. Well, you can take inspiration from, but just realize it's your world, it's your fiction. You can do what you want with it and still remain true to the original story, but by putting a completely different shell on it, you make it yours.
So I'm one of those people where I have a hard time with the concept of adaptation with things like folklore, because anybody who tells it is telling it their way. Even the Grimm's brothers wrote it down their way versus how somebody else told it to them. So do what you want, but be respectful. They're like, the Grimm brothers are a great example. They're filled with anti-Semitic ideas. So maybe look at what you're adapting and making sure that you're not transferring really terrible stereotypes over, because almost every culture has their own other that they will demify in their stories. If you're looking for something a little bit more useful than me just being blasé, there is an index out there for both motifs and stories for folklore in mythology, where it's the Sith Thompson's folklore index and the Arania Thompson story index. Sorry, I had to make sure. They list every type of interest that you could do in a folklore that they've ever seen in the world, and it's used to kind of like ratify certain stories. So like the Cinderella story has a number, so that when you see that show up repeatedly in different cultures, you can say this is a C something something. And like instead of like looking through maybe stories, you can look at the motifs and use the motifs and then take out the possibly racist and problematic issues and use the motif to adjust to that. I also have a link to a free site. I will post that somewhere because it's really easy.
They're asking for links. You are 101 Mystic or Mystic 101, and I'll give you permission to.
101 Mystic.
101 Mystic. Okay, you can post a link.
And those are some great, I love the example that you have there of the index. And they've done the work for us to boil it down to the most important thing. And yeah, I think that's a great recommendation.
Okay. The permit times out. So if I see you post again, I'll redo the permit, just so you know, Jasmin. Or my mod can do that. So okay, so I think we answered that one. So we talked about what are the differences of oral storytelling versus written, and how can these shape the folk tales over the years? That was in my next on the list.
I think one of the biggest examples there is I think I cannot remember which article I read, but there was an article out there talking about how the Australian Aboriginal folks have got the longest oral storytelling going back like 5,000, 15,000 years. And the stories have just stayed the same right the way across. And that is astounding to me. And I think the same article touched on a study done that when oral stories are passed down, they are passed down more or less the same. Like, obviously, there will be different inflections and different tones and different words stressed, but the meat of the story stays the same. But when the stories are written down is when they start changing, because that's when people look back at them and go, well, this doesn't make any sense. Oh, this would sound better if I wrote this, or that sort of thing. So I find it very strange that language that is so fluid is the one where stories have stayed so firm, but writing, which is so permanent, is where the stories change the most. And I just find that fascinating. I'll have to see if I can dig the article out, because it really hit a chord in me.
Anybody else have thoughts? I'm just checking the chat because there was an odd comment, but I think
I apologize. My computer was like, I don't want to sign you in. So I was like, oh my god.
Oh no. Well, we can always share it in the channel chat in the Discord afterwards too, if you can't get it. So oh. Okay, Mercedes got it. Repost it real quick. So there you go. Thank you. All right, awesome. Did anybody have any other thoughts on oral storytelling versus written before we go into the next one?
I think with oral storytelling, one of the things that's happened is with folklore, they write down the words, but there's important storytelling aspects that never got translated. And sometimes that's like, where do you breathe and where do you stop? Because that doesn't always translate as grammatically correct. And that sometimes drastically changes how the story is told. But when people were recording it, they were like, whatever, the words are words.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually see that a lot with the Irish storytelling, because the Irish language itself is absolutely beautiful. It's very poetic. There is a reason that the Irish Celts of old are known as the warrior poets, the Fina. They are the warrior poets, and it's because Irish as a language, when you translate it literally word for word, it's very poetic and beautiful. But then when the monks that went over and started converting the Isles to Christianity, started writing down all the folklore and fairy tales, they obviously left out a lot of the locational context, like you say, and the language they translated as they liked to hear it, and sprinkled in a load of God as well, because monks. So yeah, so you're absolutely right. The cultural, the locational context, they're all very important, and you can't really get those when you're writing things down.
And like, if you're turning this into writing your own folklore because you're writing fantasy or science fiction or some other speculative fiction, I think it's really important to remember that where you live is super important to what your folklore is. I live in the middle of the Canadian Rockies. The local tribe here, the Stoney Nakoda, have tons of stories about bison and bears and all that sort of stuff. They don't talk about lions. There are no lions in Canada. There are the big cats like cougars, but we don't have lions. That sounds like, of course, that's silly, but like, it's actually really important because their bad guys tend to mirror the naturally occurring monsters in our backyard. So like where I live, it's really high up, but if you go down the mountain, it drops by about 30 degrees to like being warmer, or like there's no wind. It's really weird. There's this weird pocket. And so that story, like area, has a bunch of stories around it because it's between the prairies where you have harsh winds and the mountains where you also have the harsh winds, and it's like super cool there.
We could go onto a tangent about the importance of world building and escaping your landscape and how it impacts different fairy tales for our fictional worlds, but I think we'll leave that for a different panel.
Okay. Sounds wise. So the next question I have, and we do have, oh my goodness, we're getting quite a few questions. We got 6 questions, so we probably just have a few more minutes to chat here. Let's see. I think one of the more important questions we had was, what is the difference between inspired by and adaptation, and at what point does it stop being a retelling and start being something original?
I mean, originality is one of those things where what does that mean? Because if you make a story with a gay person when they were straight originally, like that's still original. But one of the things that I've learned through my story is if inspiration is the vaguest outline of what that used to be, it's like when you see inspired by a true story on a horror film where like the person's head is ripping around and that sort of stuff, like the inspiredness is tiny. Adaptation is changing it into of a more modern sense, I think, where we're pulling it to the current audience. So how you do that's going to depend on who your audience is. And obviously what your background is, because like, yeah, you can take stories that have really racist things in them and then retell them. So they're, I guess, more politically correct, if you want to use those terms, but it's still an adaptation, or, you know, turning it into movies or other sort of modern media that we've never had before. Podcasts are a great example of this. There's never been a situation where you could record what someone said and then just kind of like broadcast it to anybody until very recently.
One of my favorite examples of adaptations is the fairy tale, The 12 Dancing Princesses. The original fairy tale is told from the point of view of an injured soldier who's going through and he experiences it all. He's trying to investigate all of the disappearance of the princesses, and they live happily ever after. But then you take the same story, Barbie and the 12 Dancing Princesses. Yes, I have many daughters. And I really like what they did with Barbie and the 12 Dancing Princesses, because instead of it being focused on the soldier who's investigating something like a mystery, they've turned it into Barbie, or Genevieve, into a hero story where she is saving her family. She's saving the kingdom through the power of love, the power of dance, as only a Barbie movie can do. But when you think of how the difference between the inspiration and the result, yeah, there's 12 princesses. They don't even have the soldier. They have a cobbler, and he becomes a love interest. And so you can call it the same thing, but it is very loosely based on it. So you can call, just because you call it the 12 Dancing Princesses, doesn't mean it has anything to do with the original ones. And I have another example, but I'll let someone else jump in really quick.
Oh, go ahead, Fen. Then I'll go.
Sorry. Yeah, your 12 Dancing Princesses example reminded me of Frozen. Frozen was originally the Snow Queen, the Ice Queen, whatever you want to put it. It was originally much darker. There was shards of mirror in people's eyes and people's hearts. And, it was definitely not Disney movie material, but they could have made it that way. But they, in my opinion, really dropped the ball on it. And I think Frozen was inspired by, but it was not an adaptation, because in my view, an adaptation still contains those central important points. So like we were saying earlier, like when I'm retelling a fairy tale, I need to really analyze the fairy tale and figure out what is important, what needs to be kept, and what is just stage filler. And Frozen did an inspired by, where they took the names and the location and then did their own thing, and that's fine. But the original story of the Snow Queen was perfectly good and interesting, and I feel like we're missing an opportunity to scar the next generation of children.
that scarring, yes.
We need more of those like Black Cauldron Disney, where you like have nightmares for 6 weeks after watching it.
I loved the Black Cauldron. Mum thought I was weird because I watched it straight for 3 weeks. I wore out the VHS, and she was just like, most people watch Beauty and the Beast, you know that, right?
I loved Snow White, but especially that really creepy bit where she's running through the forest and like the trees are coming alive and reaching out to her and that sort of stuff. But my mom got so annoyed with it, she cut the tape because she was just like, I don't want to listen to this anymore. Like, because I was like, it stopped and I restarted it like over and over and over again. And she's like,
oh, I would have screamed if my mom would have done that.
to be fair, I have ADHD. I hyperfocus to a very unhealthy level. And like, at the age of 5, that makes it even worse.
I won't tell you how many times I had to listen to the Pixar movie Cars in the background, but we'll leave that. Can I share that other example of mine?
I would like one chance, and then I'll... Okay, would that be fair? All right. I was trying to adding to what you had said, Greg, about adapting it to modern. I've turned what was Japanese folklore and myth and stories, figuring out how to make them be real, and for most people to not be able to see that, and then people's eyes be opened to that world. That's how I've been adapting it in my own stories. I've been, it's like, once you gain anybody can have the ability to make magic, but once you gain that, it's like your eyes open and you can see things, and it's I don't know how to explain it. There's this transition between the normal world and the not normal world, almost like Harry Potter, but different. So that's one of the ways that I handled that. So
yeah, that is pretty cool. The other example I was thinking of is comparing Disney's Cinderella with the Drew Barrymore film Ever After. And if you've seen both of them, and I really loved Ever After because it removed all of the fantastical elements. It removed all of the magic, and it still had a very compelling, very realistic and more grounded story, and it made Danielle, or the Cinderella figure, so much more realistic and more motivated. And it turned the fairy godmother, into Leonardo da Vinci. And I just loved how they were able to do that. And my favorite line is, yes, I'll go down in history as the man who opened a door. And but when we think about inspired by or an adaptation, that was a wonderful adaptation and a fresh take on the movie. Yeah, they didn't use the name Cinderella. Yeah, they didn't call him Prince Charming. It wasn't a late medieval castle. It was an early medieval, more feudal system. But the point of the story still rung true, and we could still learn the great lessons from Ever After as we did from Cinderella, but I think Ever After did it better.
I mean, Ever After is one of my favorite movies, so.
Cool.
I have to say, I was really concerned you were going to mention the original, or as close to original Cinderella, where the ugly sisters have to cut off bits of their feet.
Ooh, ooh.
That's into the scarring children for the next generation.
Yeah, we're not exposing our children to enough Watership Down type stuff nowadays.
Oh, I'm glad we aren't. We are at the point where we really need to start to answer questions. So I'm going to ask questions, and if we can have one, maybe two people at a time kind of take a question so we can get through, because we have about 6 and we've got less than 15 minutes left. And then we also have to close out and raid. So I'll start by reading questions and let you guys just kind of go through them. Question number 1 by Lord of the Sword is, how do you incorporate folklore into a story?
So do you mean in terms of making up your own folklore or making up pre-existing folklore? So if you're making up your own folklore, what I tend to do is I tend to establish rules for that folklore. For example, most of the Irish folklore that I'm familiar with has got rules when making deals with the Fae or just speaking to the Fae, because they're tricky. They are, very flighty and can go one way or the next. So rules, I think, are strangely important when incorporating folklore. So make sure that your rules are not necessarily consistent, but that there's a folklore-related reason for it. Like the Fae don't react well to iron. Well, iron was rare, back. So pure iron was very rare. So that sort of thing. It's important to have a set of rules that your folklore is focused on.
I think when wanting to include folklore into your world, if you are like adding folklore, people told stories around fires. So if you want people to be like, this is a folklore thing, it's been used in festivals around fires. It's their Netflix of the eras for a long time. So like there's lots of spaces of you can have a point where your characters are doing something and it's a break between your big movements to like sit down and talk about whatever your story was. And like, yeah, I would overgeneralize it and not like actually go page by page to drop it out. But it's a good way to start, doing character building. What characters are interested in different folklore is going to change. Like obviously a hardened soldier is not going to have the same interest as a young one who's really into the idea of battle versus the older guy who probably wants to go home. So there's areas there where you can do it, because yeah, if you don't have Netflix or TV or like even readily available books, you're going to find a way to entertain yourself, and that's often telling stories.
Okay, our next question is by Look Who's Again, I can't say that one very well, sorry. The question is, how do you handle wanting to incorporate folklore without appropriating and potentially disrespecting another culture? We kind of touched on this, but do we have a quick rundown for them?
I think the idea that Jasmin had of going to the link and using the bare bone tropes, I think is a really good one. And making sure that you remove any of the negative stereotypes that were in the original story, I think is a really good approach.
I think another thing to be careful of is the folklore that you are using around today, and is it part of an open culture? So I'm going to use Native Americans, for example. It is my understanding as a British person on the other side of the world that most Native American cultures are not open. They are closed to people within their individual tribes. So I would never ever dream of using Native American motifs or stories or anything like that in my writing, because it's not for me to do that. I'm not from that culture. That culture is still around. It's not, like you said earlier, Greg, it's not myths. That's someone's way of life. So I think that's an important thing to remember, is are there real world people that can be impacted by me taking this.
Okay, our next question is by Garnet Jasper. How do you respectfully tell the folklore of another country? It's similar to what we've been talking about, but anybody want to tackle that one?
I think it's really important to not just look at an individual story. You need to research that culture so you have an understanding of it. And if it is a living culture, be very careful with it and maybe talk to people from that culture. Like, don't just be like, I'm going to use this because I can. Because even if maybe the folklore isn't being used the way it used to, it can still mean something specific that hasn't translated well. And being cautious of these stereotypes, because sometimes, like, we don't realize that there's stereotypes in them. So if you're just looking at the story, you're like, okay, this is great. Not realizing that the stupid peasant is set up in a very specific form that we don't get because we're not in that culture, but they understand because they are in that culture.
Sensitivity are also a very good thing.
Yeah. And definitely talking, I've been researching the Japanese culture and the language and talking to my friends who are Japanese and doing everything I can to understand what's going on inside the stories or the characters that I'm pulling from. So it's very, very important to do that.
I'm just going to make one small thing. If you are going to be using a culture that maybe isn't living anymore, try and find a book that has been published after the early 2000s, because before that, colonization and kind of we're the best because we're the West is really heavy. So if you can find something after that, it tends to be a little bit more thoughtful of other cultures and not just, I happen to speak English, so clearly I'm smarter than you.
Good point. All right, the next question is by Dragon Magpie. Do you have tips on things to avoid? For example, I'm working on a race of crane-like people and taking some inspiration off general Japanese culture and tales of the crane wife. How much is too much?
I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. One of the things that you have to be careful when you're taking cookie cutters is try and make sure that there is enough holes that somebody else can fill it in, because if you like, this is how these people are, it means that there is no hole for the naturality of individuals to come through. We do this naturally because it's easier, but it's also where we start getting issues like, why are all the orcs dark skinned in Lord of the Rings? Like, I don't think Tolkien woke up one day and went, I'm going to be a racist. It's just, it was in his brain, so he put it down and then never considered it, and now it's a problem. But it definitely wasn't a problem for him then or until very recently, but it is something to be considered.
Any other thoughts before we go into the next one? Okay. Look who's fucked again. Again, next question is, who are some of your favorite authors who use and incorporate folklore?
Neil Gaiman.
Definitely.
Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett, especially in the We Free Men series, but mostly with the We Free Men, the Witches. They are a fantastic example of sort of like English folklore, of just like, you can't grow a good witch on chalk, but the bones of these hills are flint. So yeah, they take the stories that are already there and they weave them into theirs. Neil Gaiman was fantastic in doing it in American Gods. One of my favorite books, easily. I love Sandman as well, for all of the ways that he picks up all of that. So Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett for their handling of folklore and fairy tales. And Terry Pratchett especially, because I read We Free Men when I was 11 years old, and Tiffany Aching measured dinner plates after reading a fairy tale that says her eyes were the size of dinner plates. And she says 20 inches. Well, why didn't they just say? And that was in response to the river Jenny that she had just baited out of the river with her brother. And that was when, I sort of realized that, hey, I love folklore.
That's one I read to my kids. It's been a fun one. I will add the Dennis L. McKiernan series. It starts with Once Upon a Winter's Night, and it goes through all of the seasons and different retellings and expandings of fabulous fairy tales. And the first one is The East of the Sun and West of the Moon, and that's how I got interested in that story. So I can recommend that. It is a little bit adult. It's not for kids, but it's a very, very good series. So
I really like Naomi Novik's books like Uprooted and Spinning Silver, where it is very much fairy tales folklore, but one with female protagonists from their point of view. Friendship tends to be a very strong motivator versus romance, and like they're really fun and like interesting to go through. I really enjoyed reading those.
I read a recent anthology of steampunk adaptations of fairy tales on Amazon, and I don't know the name of the authors, but it was just a wonderful, a refreshing adaptation of fairy tales, and you really didn't know what the fairy tale was until you read the notes afterwards. It was just a really riveting and exciting tale in a steampunk setting. But then when they explained what the original fairy tale was, it made it even better.
cool. We are out of time. We had one more question, which if we want to, we can hop over into the chat on the Discord. It'll be Discord Room 1 chat, and we can chat about that there, but we do need to wrap up and get ready to raid next. So I'm going to start wrapping us up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jasmin. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Fen, very much for being here. Thank you to our viewers. We had more viewers than I usually ever see, so thank you, everyone. This is fabulous. You guys have been wonderful, wonderful chatters. I've been kind of watching the chat, but I can't totally keep up with it. Thank you, Misa, for helping me out with the modding today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for the follows, the bits, the hosting, the raids, everything. It's been wonderful. I really, really appreciate it. So I'm gonna pop up into here our events next, so you can check out what is coming up next. And we will be rating, looking at the Discord for author community. So we'll be going over to raid Itanshi. And if you guys don't know who, I guess we have just a minute more here. I'm not going to set up the raid, but would 2 minutes be enough to answer the last question?
Let's hear the question.
All right. Let me. I lost the window. Help! There we go. Okay. Oh, it's a long question, but hopefully we'll see if we can do it. Tips on how to create and weave in-universe folklore and mythology into created worlds. Lots of fantasy worlds build great magic systems and wonderful worlds, which for some reason don't seem to have the dozens of small things that have grown from superstitions or traditions, like horseshoes.
That is not a short answer.
Okay.
No.
we will go over to the Discord for that one then. So you guys will have to meet with us over in room 1. So what was you guys' favorite question from today?
I'm afraid I have to pop out because I have a panel that's starting in 2 minutes. So thank you so much, everyone, for what a wonderful discussion. If you want to ask me questions or follow up with anything I said, I am WriterGreg on twitch.tv and WriterGreg.com and WriterGreg on many social platforms. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day. I'll see you in the upcoming panels.
Thanks, Greg.
Take care, Greg.
And we will move the name, so Fen is really Fen, not half Fen and half Greg. Anywho, what was you guys' favorite question? And then we'll head out.
I always like talking about folklore in general, so it's hard to find a good. I like talking about it. Most people are like, Jasmin, please stop. You're just too enthusiastic. It's understandable, but also.
No, can we carry on talking afterwards? Because I found what you were saying really interesting. Let's keep
I'd
going.
love to. Yeah, we can talk forever if you
Yeah,
want
we'll
to.
head over to the chat after this. So we do need to go raid Itanshi. I'm going to set that up. Yes, it looks like we are ready to go for that. My raid call is be the difference. That's what I challenge people. Whoops, be the, if I can type, and talk difference. Oh my gosh. That's what I challenge people to do for other people. Be the difference for them and be there for them. So I'm popping that into the channel and we will go raid Itanchi. Thank you guys so much. If you guys don't know who I am Winters Voss, ShyRedFox. I stream Mondays, 12:30 to 3:30 p.m. on Central Daylight Time. It's been a pleasure to be here with you guys. Thank you so much. We are headed over into the raid. And I'm going to end our stream.